From these movements and from a general dissatisfaction with the direction of the country, a large counterculture emerges. And the point of it is to reject the establishment, reject the mainstream. And we see this in the way they dress, grooming habits, hair, clothes, speech, manners, drug use, and promiscuity all become symbols of rejecting mainstream American society and embracing a counterculture. They saw America as banal, hollow, and artificial. They talked about how we'd become separated from nature. And by the way, if you've never heard it, you should really take a minute and listen to Big Yellow Taxi. But we'll get to that later. Hippies adopt the slogan, turn on, tune in, and drop out. And where they go, for the most part, is Haight-Ashbury, an intersection there in San Francisco. And this really is the Mecca, the early Mecca of the counterculture movement. They are hedonists. Their idea is to pursue pleasure. You just do what makes you happy all the time. And hippie culture goes mainstream. Pretty soon, almost all the kids have, even if they're not really hippies, they've adopted the style of dress or maybe wear their hair that way. They're certainly listening to the music. There's a little quote from one of the Grateful Dead about this. Rock and roll, which had started as counterculture, I mean, we don't necessarily think of Elvis as being counterculture today, but it very much was. It upset mainstream Americans quite a bit because they considered it to be black music, even though he was white. But by the mid-1960s, it's everywhere. It's just become ubiquitous. In 1964, a group of British artists crossed the ocean and come over here and become massively popular. Most importantly, of course, the Beatles. But also the Rolling Stones. There I've got the great Dusty Springfield, the Who. Early rock and roll was kind of harmless. Yes, there was dancing, and it kind of encouraged you to move your hips, and that freaked people out. But it wasn't particularly political. It was a lot about being in love and having your heart broken and partying and these sorts of things. But it, of course, will evolve fairly rapidly into significant political statements. And probably the key figure in this is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan from Minnesota goes to New York. And he starts out as pretty much a straight folk singer, but then he turns electric. He begins putting more elements of rock and roll into his music, and he begins taking this genre of music that had been, She Loves You, Yeah, 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 I Want to Hold Your Hand, and he begins infusing it not only with political messages, but with fairly complex poetry and stream of conscious imagery and these things, and really makes it much more complex. And he's a pivotal figure in the transformation of popular music into something more than what it started out as. Here's some lyrics from his songs. You should listen to all Bob Dylan songs, in my opinion. He's my favorite. But you can see here, this is dangerous. This is challenging. This is the kind of thing that's going to freak people out in 1964. And Dylan is only kind of in the vanguard of a whole movement that's taking rock and roll places that it had never been and nobody had ever really predicted. You have the Beatles getting involved in Eastern philosophy and meditation. George Harrison particularly gets involved with an Indian spiritual leader. You have the Rolling Stones who become increasingly more and more sexual, of course, with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. You have Jimi Hendrix, who's really abandons all the rules of guitar playing and invents something new and beautiful and previously undreamed of. You have the Who in many ways was the most challenging, singing about cross-dressing and all kinds of disturbing things like this. And, of course, smashing their instruments at the end of the show. This tremendous kind of negative energy. You see Grace Slick flicking us off at the top. By 1969, rock and roll had evolved to the point where it could have a giant, massive festival, and this is Woodstock. Woodstock's held in New York. Actually, the idea, Bob Dylan had been hurt in a motorcycle accident, and the idea was to have a get-well party for Bob Dylan, but the town where he lived in wouldn't let them have it there, and he seemed, quite frankly, a little bit annoyed by the whole idea. And so these two kind of eager young kids who are putting this thing together, the closest they can get is Woodstock, and that's how we end up with this massive music festival. 400,000 people show up. And depending on who you ask, it was either the greatest thing ever or miserable. It rained, it was muddy, there were bad drugs there. But here's a really fascinating little exchange from the film Woodstock, which is also worth watching if you have the time. And you might take this and read this, and you get a different idea of the mainstream and the counterculture from this quote than you might have thought. It was Altamont 4 months later where everything is going to begin to come unglued. This is in San Francisco. And the Rolling Stones are the headlining band. And the organizers of this concert hire Hell's Angels to be their security guards. There's lots of drugs, which leads to lots of medical episodes and some violence. And when a riot breaks out, the Hells Angels, who had been hired to provide security, will kill 4 people, will knife them to death. And it's this sense of like Woodstock, which had been fairly peaceful and kind of beautiful and this amazing coming together. Just 4 months later is followed by Altamont, which had really been this dystopian counterculture nightmare in a lot of ways. Although the Stones played, so that's cool.